I sat in my patrol car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. 20 minutes had passed since I'd pulled into the lot, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside yet. The encounter kept playing on repeat in my head, each detail sharper than I wanted it to be. Route 47 stretched empty in both directions when I'd spotted her. A young woman with long dark hair, thumb extended, standing beside the shoulder like she'd been waiting specifically for me. Standard protocol said don't stop for hitchhikers, but something about her seemed different. Vulnerable, maybe, or just normal enough that my instincts told me she needed help. I'd pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. She'd climbed in without hesitation, settling into the seat with this quiet politeness that made me think she was probably a college student heading back to campus. Her hair fell across most of her face, but what I could see looked young, tired. "Where are you headed?" I'd asked, checking my mirrors before pulling back onto the road. The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. The temperature in the car dropped so fast I could see my breath. The girl turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of her eyes through the hair, completely hollow, like someone had scooped out everything behind them. Then she was gone, just vanished from the passenger seat like she'd never been there at all. I'd slammed on the brakes, heart hammering as I stared at the empty seat. No door opening, no sound of movement. Nothing but the lingering cold and this crawling sensation across my skin that felt like being watched by something hungry. The drive back to Millbrook had taken forever. Every shadow on the roadside looked like it might be her, waiting for another ride. Now I had to go inside and pretend everything was normal. Except I knew it wasn't. The rules existed for a reason, and I'd just broken one of them. The worst part was that I knew better. We all did. I finally forced myself out of the car and walked toward the station entrance. The building looked the same as always, red brick, narrow windows, the kind of small-town police station that had probably been here since the 1960s. But something felt different now, like the whole world had shifted a few degrees off its axis. Thomas was at his desk when I walked in, surrounded by manila folders and case files that looked older than me. His gray hair was more disheveled than usual, and he had that focused expression he got when reviewing the difficult cases, the ones we didn't talk about in polite company. Eddie glanced up from his computer as I passed his desk. He gave me a quick nod, the kind of casual acknowledgement we'd all perfected after working together for 3 years. Normal. Professional. Nothing out of the ordinary. I should have kept walking to my own desk. Should have filed my patrol report and gone home like any other Tuesday. Instead, I found myself standing beside Thomas's chair, watching him flip through incident reports with methodical precision. "Thomas," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. He looked up, pen still in his hand. "What's on your mind, Martinez?" I opened my mouth to say it was nothing, that I just wanted to check in before heading home. The lie was right there, ready to roll off my tongue, but the memory of those hollow eyes stopped me cold. "I picked up a hitchhiker today," I said. "On Route 47. The pen dropped from Thomas's fingers and clattered onto the desk. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Eddie's typing stopped abruptly. "Tell me you didn't speak to her," Thomas said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. I looked at his face and saw something I'd never seen in my sheriff's eyes. Genuine fear, not the controlled concern he showed during domestic calls or the calculated caution he maintained during traffic stops. This was raw, personal terror. I asked where she was headed, I admitted. Eddie's chair creaked as he turned around completely. His face had gone pale and he was staring at me like I'd just confessed to murder. Thomas leaned back in his chair and ran a hand over his face. "Jesus, Rebecca!" "She disappeared," I continued, needing to get it all out. "Right there in the passenger seat, just gone." "Of course she did." Thomas pushed away from his desk and stood up. He moved to the window that overlooked Main Street, but I could tell he wasn't really looking at anything. The others, when they break the rules, they run into problems, weird incidents, unexplained occurrences. But speaking to one of them, he trailed off. "What?" I pressed. Thomas turned back to face me. "My predecessor, Sheriff McCready, he ran from a hitchhiker once. Thought he could outrun the consequences. Found him dead in his apartment 2 weeks later. Heart attack," the coroner said. But there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of anything wrong, just a man who'd been scared to death. Eddie was nodding like he'd heard this story before. "But speaking to one is different," he said quietly. "Different how?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Thomas walked back to his desk and started gathering the files into a neat stack. "When you speak to them, you invite them in. Create a connection. McCready was running from his problem, but you..." He looked at me directly. "You're going to have a visitor." The way he said it made my stomach twist. "What kind of visitor?" "The girl you picked up. She'll come back, and when she does, what you experienced today will seem like a pleasant memory." Thomas locked the files in his desk drawer. "The consequences for speaking to a hitchhiker are significant." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in Thomas's expression told me the conversation was over. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed toward the door. "Go home, Martinez," he said. "Get some rest. And remember, whatever happens, don't invite her inside." Eddie was already shutting down his computer. "You want me to follow you home?" he asked. "Just to make sure you get there okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though we all knew that wasn't true. "Thanks anyway." They left together, and I stayed behind to finish my paperwork. The station felt different with just me in it. Too quiet, too empty. Every creak of the building settling made me look up from my reports. When I finally finished and locked up, the parking lot felt like it stretched for miles. The drive to my apartment on Oak Street took longer than usual. I found myself checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat with that impossible stillness. But the car stayed empty, and I made it to my building without incident. I pulled into my assigned spot and sat there for a moment, looking up at the windows of my second-floor apartment. Everything looked normal. Safe. Just another Tuesday evening in Millbrook. Then the radio crackled. Static filled the car, loud and harsh, cutting through the silence like broken glass. I reached for the volume knob, but before I could turn it down, the static shifted, changed, became something that sounded almost like a voice. A young girl's voice, whispering my name through the speakers. "Rebecca." I yanked the key from the ignition so fast I nearly broke it. The radio went dead. But the sound of my name seemed to hang in the air like smoke. I sat in the sudden silence, hands shaking, knowing that this was just the beginning. I jolted awake to the sound of deliberate, measured knocking at my front door. The digital clock beside my bed glowed 3:17 a.m. in harsh red numbers. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of restless sleep since getting home from the station, my mind cycling through Thomas's warnings and that whispered voice from the radio. Now someone was at my door at 3 in the morning, and I knew exactly who it was. The knocking came again, 3 slow, even raps that seemed to carry through my apartment like they were meant to wake the dead. I rolled out of bed and grabbed my service weapon from the nightstand, checking that it was loaded before padding barefoot to the front door. The hardwood felt cold beneath my feet, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly as I approached the peephole. Through the tiny fisheye lens, I saw her. The same young woman from Route 47 stood motionless on my porch, her long, dark hair falling across most of her face in exactly the same way it had in my patrol car. She wore different clothes now, a pale dress that looked too thin for the October night, but everything else was identical. The way she held herself, perfectly still like a statue. The unnatural quality to her presence that made my skin crawl. Her lips were moving. I watched through the peephole as her mouth formed words in a steady rhythmic pattern. but no sound penetrated the door. She could have been reciting poetry or speaking my name over and over again. The movement was hypnotic and wrong, like watching someone have a conversation with the air. The knocking resumed, and I backed away from the door so quickly I nearly tripped over my own feet. 3 more raps, measured and patient. Then silence. Then 3 more. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door frame, weapon raised but knowing it wouldn't do any good against whatever she was. Thomas's words echoed in my head. Don't invite her inside. The first rule was about knocking before entering, but this was different. She was knocking to get in, and I wasn't about to let that happen. The pattern continued for what felt like hours. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Sometimes I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate movement from one side to the other, like she was testing different angles or looking for another way in. When I worked up the courage to check the peephole again, she was always in the same position, facing the door with that mechanical lip movement. My phone showed 4:02 a.m. when the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. I stayed pressed against the wall, weapon ready, waiting for something else to happen. A window breaking, maybe, or the sound of her voice calling my name like it had through the radio. But minutes passed with nothing but the normal nighttime sounds of my building. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic on the main road. I crept back to the peephole and looked out. The porch was empty. My hands shook as I dialed Eddie's number. It rang twice before he picked up, sounding instantly alert despite the hour. "Martinez, what's wrong?" She was here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "At my door, knocking for almost an hour. I'll be right there." The line went dead, and I realized Eddie hadn't asked for my address or any other details. He knew exactly what I was talking about, which somehow made everything worse. I spent the next 15 minutes pacing my living room, checking the locks on my windows and trying not to look outside. When I heard Eddie's patrol car pull into the lot, relief flooded through me like cold water. I watched through the front window as he got out, flashlight in hand, and began examining my porch. He knocked. 3 quick, professional raps that sounded nothing like what I'd heard earlier. "It's Eddie," he called out. I unlocked the door and let him in, noting how he immediately swept the interior with his eyes, checking corners and doorways like he was clearing a crime scene. "Tell me what happened," he said, holstering his flashlight. I described the knocking, the timing, what I'd seen through the peephole. Eddie listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as I talked about the moving lips and the methodical pattern of sound. "Found nothing out there," he said when I finished. "No footprints, no sign anyone was ever on your porch. But that doesn't mean anything with these things." He moved to my front window and looked out at the street. "This is just the beginning, Rebecca. When you speak to one of them, they claim you. They'll keep escalating until you either give in or find a way to break their hold." "Give in how?" Eddie turned away from the window. "Invite them inside. Open the door. Let them complete whatever connection you started when you picked her up." He paused. "Or they'll drive you to the point where you just can't fight anymore." The way he said it reminded me of Thomas's story about his predecessor, Sheriff McCready, scared to death in his own apartment. "You shouldn't stay here tonight," Eddie continued. "Pack a bag. You can crash at my place." I wanted to argue, to insist I could handle whatever came next, but the memory of those moving lips stopped me. She had stood on my porch for 45 minutes, patient and relentless, like she had all the time in the world. 20 minutes later, I was following Eddie's taillights through the empty streets of Millbrook, an overnight bag in my back seat, and my service weapon in the passenger seat. His house sat in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of town, a modest ranch-style place with a neat lawn and security lights that cast everything in harsh white. Eddie showed me to his guest room, which looked like it had been used recently. Clean sheets on the bed, fresh towels on the dresser. "Other people have needed a safe place to stay," he explained when he saw me looking around. "This isn't my first time dealing with these situations." I changed into comfortable clothes and tried to settle in. but sleep felt impossible. Every sound from outside made me tense. Cars passing on the street, a dog barking in the distance, the wind moving through the trees. At some point around 5 in the morning, I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling the house. I got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The backyard looked empty in the security lighting, just Eddie's neat lawn and a chain-link fence separating his property from the neighbors. But the footsteps continued, making a complete circuit around the building before starting over again. The sound went on until dawn. When morning came, Eddie found me sitting on the edge of the guest bed, still fully dressed, staring out the window at his backyard. He looked like he hadn't slept much either. "You heard them too," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Walking around the house, all night. Eddie moved to the window and examined the glass. "Come look at this." I joined him and saw what had made him call me over. Scratch marks covered the window, thin lines etched into the glass that formed letters. The scratches were fresh, white against the surface, like they'd been made with something sharp and metallic. They spelled out my full name, Rebecca Elena Martinez. "These weren't here yesterday," Eddie said quietly. "I check my windows every morning as part of my routine." I stared at the letters, each one precisely formed, like someone had taken their time to get the spacing exactly right. She knew who I was. Not just Officer Martinez or the woman who'd picked her up on Route 47. She knew my middle name, which wasn't on my badge or uniform name tag. "How does she know?" I asked. Eddie stepped away from the window. "They know everything once you let them in. Speaking to her created a connection, and now she can see whatever she needs to see about you." He looked at me directly. "This is why the rules exist. This is why we don't break them." I kept staring at my name scratched into the glass, knowing that wherever I went in Millbrook, she would find me. The hitchhiker wasn't just haunting me, she was hunting me, and she had all the information she needed to make it personal. Eddie drove me to the station at 8 a.m. after we'd both given up on sleep. Eddie looked like he'd spent the night standing guard by his windows, which, knowing what we'd heard circling the house, he probably had. Thomas was already at his desk when we walked in, but he wasn't reviewing case files this time. Instead, he had a thick black binder open in front of him, filled with what looked like handwritten notes and photocopied newspaper clippings. He looked up as we approached, taking in my rumpled appearance and Eddie's alert, protective stance. "How bad was it?" Thomas asked. Eddie answered for me. "She knows Rebecca's full name. Scratched it into my guest room window during the night. Made a circuit around my house for hours." Thomas nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected. "Sit down, both of you. It's time you understood what we're really dealing with here." I dropped into the chair beside his desk, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into my bones. Eddie remained standing, positioning himself where he could see both the front entrance and the back hallway. "Our town sits on what the locals used to call a thin place," Thomas began, his finger tracing the edge of the open binder. "Somewhere the supernatural world bleeds through more easily than it should. These things that appear as hitchhikers, they're not human. Never were. They're something that feeds on breaking people's will to live." He turned a page in the binder, revealing a newspaper clipping from 1987 with the headline, "Local Woman Found Dead in Apartment." The photo showed a young woman in a police uniform, and I recognized the station in the background. "They don't just want to scare you," Thomas continued. "They want to consume something deeper. Your ability to keep fighting, your desire to stay alive. They'll escalate the encounters, each one worse than the last, until their victim either takes their own life or simply disappears." Eddie spoke up from his position by the door. "My encounter was 3 years ago. Different hitchhiker, but same pattern. Started with her controlling my car's radio, changing stations, cranking the volume so high it hurt. Then she got into the air conditioning system, making it so cold I could see my breath 1 minute. Then so hot I was sweating through my uniform the next." "How long did it last?" I asked. 2 weeks. She'd appear in my rearview mirror, mess with the car's electronics, then vanish when I tried to confront her. Eddie's jaw tightened. The worst part was when she started playing recordings of my own voice through the radio, things I'd never said, conversations I'd never had, like she was showing me how easily she could manipulate reality. Thomas flipped to another page, this one showing a police report from 1994. The rules exist because we've learned what works and what doesn't. My deputy back then, Jim Hawkins, saw something that proved these entities can take multiple forms. He was patrolling Route 47 when he spotted a hitchhiker, young man this time, standing beside a dog. "What's unusual about that?" I asked. "The dog was walking upright," Thomas said flatly, standing on its hind legs like a person, perfectly balanced, keeping pace with the hitchhiker as they moved down the shoulder. Jim was smart enough not to stop, but he watched them in his mirrors for almost a mile. The dog never dropped to all fours, never broke its human-like gait. The image made my stomach turn. I thought about the girl I'd picked up, how perfectly still she'd sat in my passenger seat, and wondered what other forms she might take. Thomas turned several more pages, revealing a collection of incident reports spanning decades. The pattern is always the same once someone speaks to them. First contact within 24 hours, then escalating encounters designed to wear down the victim's resistance. Most people break within a week. "What happens when they break?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "They give up fighting, stop following the rules. Some invite the entity inside their homes. Others just disappear. We find their cars abandoned on back roads or their apartments empty with no signs of forced entry." Thomas's voice lowered. "Your predecessor, Officer Janet Rodriguez, broke the same rule you did. 5 years ago." The name hit me like a punch to the chest. I'd taken Rodriguez's position when I joined the force, but no one had ever explained what happened to her. I'd assumed she'd transferred or quit. "Janet was a good officer," Thomas continued. "Careful, by the book, respected the rules. But one night on Route 47, she stopped for what looked like a teenage girl with a broken-down car. The moment she asked if the girl needed help, the pattern started." Eddie had moved closer to Thomas's desk, reading over my shoulder as Thomas showed us Janet's incident reports. The progression was horrifying. Radio interference on night 1, mysterious phone calls on night 3, the entity appearing in her apartment by the end of the first week. "Janet fought for 3 weeks," Thomas said. "Longer than most, but the encounters kept getting worse. The entity started appearing as her dead mother, then as her childhood pet, then as versions of herself. By the end, Janet was calling in sick, afraid to leave her apartment, afraid to stay inside." "How did she die?" I asked. "We found her in her living room, doors unlocked, no signs of struggle. Coroner said heart failure, but she was 28 years old and in perfect health." Thomas closed the binder. "I think she finally stopped fighting, let the hitchhiker in, and whatever happened next killed her." The station felt too quiet after he finished speaking. I could hear the wall clock ticking, the distant hum of traffic on Main Street, the sound of my own breathing. Everything normal and everyday, but charged with new meaning now that I understood what I was facing. My phone buzzed against the desk where I'd set it down. A text message from an unknown number. Just 7 characters, 9:00 p.m. I showed it to Thomas and Eddie. Before either of them could respond, another message came through, 10:00 p.m. Then another, 11:00 p.m. "She's scheduling her visits," Thomas said grimly, "letting you know exactly when to expect her. It's psychological warfare, making you dread specific times instead of living in constant uncertainty." Eddie leaned over my shoulder to read the messages. "This is Escalation. She's not just going to show up randomly anymore. She's going to make every hour a countdown to the next encounter." I stared at the times on my phone screen, feeling trapped in a schedule I never agreed to. 9 p.m. was 13 hours away, but knowing it was coming made every minute feel like a weight settling on my chest. "What do I do?" I asked. Thomas reopened the binder and flipped to a page near the back, covered in his own handwriting. "We follow the rules. We don't invite her in. We don't engage beyond what you've already done. And we find a way to break the connection before it breaks you." He looked at me directly, and I saw the same fear in his eyes that had been there yesterday when I'd first told him about the hitchhiker. But underneath it was something else: determination. Janet was alone when this happened to her. You're not. I spent the rest of my shift at the station trying to focus on paperwork while watching the clock crawl toward 9 p.m. Every case report felt meaningless compared to the countdown happening on my phone, where those 3 text messages sat like appointment reminders for my own destruction. Thomas kept glancing over from his desk, and Eddie found excuses to walk past mine throughout the day. Their concern was obvious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my mistake to fix. I'd broken the rule. I'd spoken to the hitchhiker when every officer in Millbrook knew better. "You don't have to face this alone," Thomas said around 7 p.m., closing his case files for the day. "Yes, I do." I saved my report and logged off the computer. This started because I picked her up. It needs to end the same way. Eddie pushed back from his desk. "That's not how this works, Rebecca. These things want to isolate you, make you think you're fighting alone." "But I am alone in this." I stood up and grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair. "You both did your jobs. You followed the rules. I'm the one who screwed up." Thomas walked over and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Janet thought the same thing. Pride got her killed. The comparison stung, but it didn't change my decision. I needed to face whatever was coming at 9 p.m., and I needed to do it on my own terms, not hiding at Eddie's house or using the station as a fortress. I left the station at 8:30, giving myself time to get home and prepare. The drive to Oak Street felt longer than usual, every shadow along the roadside making me check my mirrors. My building looked normal when I pulled into the parking lot. Quiet, residential neighborhood, porch lights glowing, other tenants going about their evening routines. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment and unlocked the door, checking my phone as I stepped inside. 8:45 p.m., 15 minutes until the first scheduled encounter. My apartment felt different now that I knew she could find me anywhere. The familiar furniture and personal belongings looked fragile, like stage props that could be rearranged or destroyed at will. I double-checked the locks on my front door and windows, knowing they wouldn't stop her, but needing to do something with my hands. At exactly 9 p.m., my doorbell rang. The sound was normal, the same 2-tone chime I heard whenever the mail carrier needed a signature or a neighbor stopped by. But the timing made my skin crawl. She was punctual. I moved to the peephole and looked out. The hitchhiker stood on my porch in the same pale dress from last night, but this time her face was fully visible. No hair covering her features, no shadows hiding the hollow spaces where her eyes should have been. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with skin that seemed too pale in the porch light. Her mouth moved in that same rhythmic pattern I'd seen before, lips forming silent words. The doorbell rang again, followed by 3 gentle knocks. I stepped away from the door and waited. The rules were clear. Don't invite her in. Don't open the door. Don't engage beyond what I'd already done. But she didn't leave after a few minutes like last night. Instead, I heard footsteps moving across my porch, then the sound of her walking down the exterior stairs. My apartment was on the second floor, which meant she was circling the building on foot, testing other entry points. I went to my bedroom window and peered through the blinds. She was in the parking lot now, moving slowly around the perimeter of the building with that same measured pace I'd heard at Eddie's house. When she reached the back corner, she looked up directly at my window. Even from 2 stories up, those hollow eyes seemed to lock onto mine. She raised one hand and pointed at the glass. I jerked away from the window so fast I knocked over my bedside lamp. The crash seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment, and I immediately regretted making any noise. Drawing attention to myself felt dangerous, like I was encouraging her somehow. The footsteps continued their circuit around the building. I tracked her progress by moving from window to window, always staying hidden behind the blinds. She tested the exterior doors to the building, tried to look into ground floor windows, and spent several minutes standing directly beneath my apartment. At 10 p.m., the knocking changed. Instead of gentle raps, heavy pounding shook my front door. The sound echoed through the apartment like someone was using their fists with serious force. Between the pounding, I heard her voice for the first time, not through a radio or phone, but actually speaking. "Rebecca Elena Martinez," she called out, pronouncing each syllable of my full name with careful precision. Rebecca Elena Martinez. The lights in my living room began to flicker. Not random electrical problems, but a deliberate pattern that matched the rhythm of her knocking. The overhead fixture would flash 3 times, pause, then flash 3 times again. My kitchen lights joined in, then the lamp beside my couch until every bulb in the apartment was participating in her synchronized display. The pounding intensified, and I realized something impossible was happening. The sound wasn't just coming from my front door anymore. It was coming from inside my apartment. I turned toward my living room and saw her standing beside my coffee table, still wearing that pale dress, still moving her mouth without making sound. She hadn't opened any doors. I would have heard them. But she was inside my space now, looking around my furniture and belongings like she was taking inventory. When she noticed me watching from the hallway, she smiled. Not a friendly expression, but something mechanical and wrong, like someone had taught her the shape of happiness without explaining what it meant. Her hollow eyes stayed fixed on my face while her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed too white and too sharp. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter and moved toward the front door. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to walk calmly, keeping the hitchhiker in my peripheral vision. She didn't move as I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped onto the porch. The cool October air hit my face as I made it down the stairs to the parking lot. My patrol car sat in its assigned spot, looking solid and real compared to the supernatural nightmare upstairs. I got behind the wheel and started the engine, checking my rearview mirror out of habit. She was sitting in my back seat, not the same position as when she'd vanished during our first encounter. This time she sat directly behind me, close enough that I could see her pale dress in perfect detail. Her mouth was no longer moving silently. Instead, she spoke in a clear, conversational tone that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. "Why are you running?" she asked. "You already invited me in when you spoke to me." Her voice sounded exactly like what I'd expected. Young, pleasant, completely at odds with her hollow eyes and predatory smile. She could have been any college student asking for directions. "You picked me up," she continued. "You asked where I was going. That was your invitation, Rebecca Elena Martinez. Running won't change what you started." I put the car in reverse and backed out of my parking space, refusing to look at her directly in the mirror. The rules said not to engage, but she was right there, speaking to me like we were having a normal conversation. "I know where you're going," she said as I turned onto Oak Street. "The police station. You think it will protect you?" I drove toward Main Street, taking the most direct route to the station. The familiar streets of Millbrook looked different at night, with long shadows between the streetlights and empty storefronts that seemed to watch me pass. "Your friend Eddie thought his house would protect him," she continued, "but I found him anyway, just like I found you." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. She knew about Eddie's encounter, which meant she knew about all of us. The connection she'd formed by speaking to me had given her access to more than just my personal information. "The station won't help you," she said, "but please drive there anyway. I want to see where you work." I turned onto Main Street and saw the police station ahead, its parking lot illuminated by security lights. The building looked exactly the same as always. Solid brick construction, American flag out front. The kind of place that represented order and safety in a small town. But as I pulled into the lot, I realized she was right. Running to the station wasn't going to solve anything. It was just another place for her to find me, another location she could contaminate with her presence. I parked beside the front entrance and finally looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She was smiling that mechanical smile again, waiting to see what I would do next. I took a deep breath and shut off the engine. The hitchhiker remained in my back seat, that pleasant conversational voice still echoing in my head, but I refused to look at her reflection again. Whatever was waiting for me inside the station had to be better than sitting in a car with a supernatural predator. The front entrance was unlocked when I pushed through the glass doors. The lobby felt different at night, too quiet, with harsh, fluorescent lighting that made everything look stark and clinical. My footsteps echoed across the polished floor as I walked toward the main office area. The hitchhiker was sitting at my desk, not standing beside it or hovering nearby, but actually seated in my chair like she belonged there. She had positioned herself exactly where I usually sat during my shifts, her pale dress a stark contrast against the dark fabric of the office chair. Her hands rested on the desk's surface, fingers spread flat against the wood like she was claiming ownership. She looked up when I entered, that mechanical smile still in place. Every light in the office was on, illuminating the empty desks and abandoned coffee cups from the day shift. The building felt hollow around us, like we were the only two people left in the world. "Running won't work," she said, her voice carrying easily across the space between us. "The connection exists now. It can't be broken by hiding or changing locations." I stopped about 10 feet from my desk, close enough to see her clearly, but far enough to maintain distance. Her hollow eyes tracked my movement with perfect precision, like a predator watching prey decide which direction to run. "You spoke to me," she continued. "You asked where I was going. That created an invitation that goes deeper than words. It's in the fabric of what you are now." The way she said it made my stomach turn. Not just a supernatural curse or temporary haunting, but something that had fundamentally changed me by speaking to her, like she'd reached inside and rewired something essential. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You want to understand the rules so you can find a way around them. But there is no way around this, Rebecca Elena Martinez. There is only acceptance." Her use of my full name felt different now that she was sitting in my workspace. More personal, like she was claiming not just me, but everything connected to my life. My job, my colleagues, the place where I felt most capable and in control. "Where is everyone?" I asked, breaking my own rule about not engaging. She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "They left, hours ago. This place is empty except for us." But even as she said it, I heard movement from the back hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward the main office. The hitchhiker's expression shifted, that pleasant mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something angry underneath. Thomas appeared in the doorway that led to the back offices, fully dressed and alert like he'd been waiting for hours. He looked first at me, then at the hitchhiker sitting at my desk, his expression grim but not surprised. "I wondered when you'd bring her here," he said to me. The hitchhiker turned in my chair to face him, her movements unnaturally smooth. "You know what I am." "I know what you are," Thomas confirmed, "and I know what you want. But she's not ready to give it to you." Thomas walked past both of us to his own desk, where he pulled out the black binder from earlier. He flipped through several pages before finding what he was looking for, then looked up at me. "There's one way to break the connection," he said, "but it requires going back to where this started." The hitchhiker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think returning to Route 47 will change anything?" The invitation was made. The words were spoken. "The words can be taken back," Thomas said firmly, "but only at the exact location where they were first given." I felt something shift in the air between them, like I was watching a negotiation I didn't fully understand. Thomas had knowledge the hitchhiker didn't want him to share, and she was realizing that her control over the situation wasn't as complete as she'd assumed. "You have to return her to the precise spot where you picked her up," Thomas explained to me. "Not just Route 47, but the exact location, and you have to reject the conversation that started this. Tell her you take back your words and refuse the connection." The hitchhiker's form flickered for a moment, like a television signal losing reception. When she solidified again, her pleasant expression had been replaced by something colder. "That won't work," she said. But I heard uncertainty in her voice for the first time. "It will work," Thomas said, "because that's how the rules function. Invitations can be rescinded if they're rejected at their point of origin." I looked between them, trying to process what Thomas was proposing. Drive back to Route 47 in the middle of the night with both him and the supernatural entity that had been terrorizing me. Return to the exact spot where I'd made my mistake and somehow undo it. "What happens if it doesn't work?" I asked. Thomas met my eyes directly. "Then we deal with whatever comes next. But Rebecca, this is your only chance to break free of this. If you don't try tonight, the connection will become permanent." The hitchhiker stood up from my chair with that same unnatural smoothness. "He's not telling you everything. Breaking the connection will have consequences for your precious town." "What kind of consequences?" I asked. Thomas answered before she could. "We'll deal with those when we have to. Right now, the priority is getting you free of this." He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed toward the front entrance. The hitchhiker watched him go, then turned back to me with that mechanical smile returning. "Very well," she said. "Let's return to Route 47. The drive took 20 minutes through empty Millbrook streets. Thomas sat in the passenger seat of his own patrol car while I drove, both of us silent as we headed toward the highway. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the back seat remained empty until we turned onto Route 47. She materialized behind Thomas this time, sitting directly in the center of the seat, like she wanted to be visible to both of us. Her pale dress looked stark against the dark interior of the car, and when I glanced in the mirror, those hollow eyes were fixed on mine. "You're making a mistake," she said conversationally. "The protection your town enjoys exists because certain agreements were made long ago. Breaking connections isn't as simple as saying words at the right location." Thomas turned in his seat to look at her directly. "Those agreements are still in place. What we're doing tonight doesn't change that." "Doesn't it?" she asked. "Every rule broken weakens the barriers. Every connection severed creates cracks in the foundation." I focused on the road ahead, looking for the spot where I'd first seen her. Route 47 stretched out in the darkness, empty except for our headlights cutting through the night. The familiar landmarks came into view: the old barn, the rusted guardrail, the grove of trees where she'd been standing. "There," I said, pointing ahead. "Right by those trees." I pulled over at the exact location, the car's tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. This was where it had all started, where I'd made the decision to stop and help what I thought was a stranded college student. The trees looked different at night, more threatening, like they were leaning in to listen. Thomas and I got out of the car, but the hitchhiker remained in the back seat. Through the rear window, I could see her watching us with that predatory patience she'd shown from the beginning. "What exactly do I say?" I asked Thomas. "Tell her you take back your words. Reject the invitation you made when you asked where she was going. Be specific and direct." I walked around to the passenger side of the car and opened the rear door. The hitchhiker looked up at me, no longer smiling, her expression neutral and waiting. "I take back my words," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet night air. "When I asked where you were going, I was wrong to speak to you. I reject that conversation and refuse the connection it created." Her form began to waver, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The sharp edges of her features became blurred and uncertain, and for a moment I could see through her to the car's interior. "You think this ends anything?" she asked, her voice distorting as her form became less solid. "Others will come now. Your town's protection has been tested and found wanting. The barriers are weaker because of what you've done." Her image flickered more rapidly, pieces of her disappearing and reappearing like a damaged video feed. But her voice remained clear, cutting through the distortion with perfect clarity. "New hitchhikers will arrive within days. Stronger ones, hungrier ones. Your little rules won't protect you from what's coming." She vanished completely, leaving only the empty back seat and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The sudden absence of her presence felt like pressure being released from my ears, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Thomas walked around the car to stand beside me. "How do you feel?" I took inventory of my body and mind, searching for any lingering connection to the entity that had been haunting me. The constant sense of being watched was gone. The crawling feeling under my skin had disappeared. For the first time in days, I felt completely alone in my own head. "Free," I said. "It worked." Thomas nodded and closed the rear door. "The connection is broken. She can't claim you anymore." We got back in the car and I started the engine, pulling away from the trees and back onto Route 47. But as we drove toward town, Thomas's expression remained troubled. "She wasn't lying about the consequences," he said. "Breaking the connection like that sends a signal to other entities. It tells them our defenses can be tested." I looked at him, not liking the sound of that. "What kind of signal?" "That someone in Millbrook was strong enough to break free from a supernatural claim. To entities like her, that makes our town more interesting, not less." As if to prove his point, I saw movement along the roadside ahead. A figure standing beside the highway, thumb extended in the classic hitchhiker pose. We passed close enough for me to see it was a middle-aged man in a worn jacket, but something about his posture was wrong. Too rigid, too perfectly still. "Don't look directly at him," Thomas warned, but I'd already turned to watch him in the side mirror. Two more figures appeared further down the road, then another. All of them standing in that same unnaturally still position. All of them watching our car pass with perfect coordination. "They're already coming," I said. Thomas leaned forward to look through the windshield. "Your ordeal actually strengthened the town's defenses by proving the rules still work when they're properly followed, but it also announced that we're worth their attention." By the time we reached Millbrook's town limits, I'd counted 7 different hitchhikers positioned along Route 47, each one different from the others. Men and women of various ages, all wearing clothes that seemed slightly wrong for the current season or decade. All of them standing with that same supernatural stillness that marked them as something other than human. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" I asked as we pulled into the station parking lot. Thomas got out of the car and looked back toward the highway, where distant figures were still visible in the darkness. "The rules will be more important than ever now. Every officer in the county will need to understand what we're dealing with." I locked the patrol car and followed him toward the station entrance, but I couldn't stop thinking about those figures along the roadside. 7 new threats, maybe more, all drawn to Millbrook because I'd broken a rule and then found a way to break free. My job protecting the town from supernatural threats was just beginning, and the rules Thomas kept in that black binder would be the only thing standing between us and whatever was coming next.